Hey friends, this book has been one of the most helpful books to me in studying and preparing to teach on the Beatitudes. If you want to understand the Beatitudes more deeply, then you need this book. This is an essential resource. Let me tell you why. The book here that I have is The Beatitudes Through the Ages by Rebekah Eklund, published by Eerdmans in 2021. I bought this book with my own money, and this is a totally independent review. I don't know anybody here. I find this book to be fabulous. I bought this book personally because this summer I'm doing a week's worth of teaching on the Beatitudes, and as I'm preparing and reading commentaries, I kept coming up against this wall and was getting a little bit frustrated and lost with all of the different interpretations on the Beatitudes. And there's a lot of them. So I was looking for a book that would give me a wider and deeper understanding of the Beatitudes. And this book really did the job for me. It's so easy, I find. I don't know if you have this difficulty yourself, but I find that it's so easy to get stuck in your own thinking about what the passage means. It only means this, and all other views are weird or wrong. And what this book does is it helps me and helps you to see that there are other options out there, and there's other ways of seeing the Beatitudes. Also, that some of the interpretive options are not just new options, but have long historical roots. For instance, when the first Beatitude talks about blessed are the poor in spirit, it might be tempting to think that those interpretations which talk about ministering to the poor is all about social justice, that this is a recent phenomenon. But in reality, this interpretation actually has a long history within the church. So it helps to show that this particular interpretation is not just a prisoner of the moment. That doesn't necessarily make it right or wrong, but it does help us to see where the trajectory and where the history of these sorts of interpretations come from. I have found that the true joy and helpfulness of this book is that it illuminates the Beatitudes while challenging your assumptions about them. It helps you to see the Beatitudes in new light. I have been blessed by being encouraged and challenged in how I understand this scripture with this book. And in this review, I want to just talk briefly about what the book is about, who it's for, and then I'm going to give some observations / pros, and then some questions / cons about this book. Eklund also has a superpower in this book that I'll talk about toward the end of the book. So let's dive into it a little bit. What is this book about? Well, Eklund describes this as a history of interpretation. You see it in the title of the book itself, right? The Beatitudes Through the Ages. So this is a history of interpretation, or what she calls a reception history. And this might sound boring, but this book is not boring at all. What Eklund is interested in with this book is not just tracking all these different meanings, but looking at the effect that the Beatitudes have had throughout history. And she's going to give you lots of different views, really all the different views that have been available primarily throughout history. And this sounds overwhelming. And maybe this is like, I don't want that. That's overwhelming. And Eklund even acknowledges this when she says towards the end of the book, the Beatitudes, quote, the Beatitudes were never this complicated, end quote. But her hope from this study is that it will allow us, that having this complication to our understanding of the Beatitudes will allow us to see the Beatitudes with, quote, depth and beauty and not as a burden. So this complexity helps us to see the beauty, helps us to see the depth of these passages, and it should not be something of a burden. And she's really right that this does add a lot of complexity to my understanding, at any rate, of these texts. I've found that I've wrestled over these passages in a much greater and deeper way through her listing of all these different views than I had if it was just me working through the commentaries or working through the text. So this book is a real blessing, as I've said before, in encouraging and also challenging some of those assumptions. Now, if we just take a high-level look at an overview of the book itself, Eklund gives a few introductory chapters to help explain some of the high-level issues that keep popping up in our study of the Beatitudes, and she tries to help orient us to them. And she does this really, really well. So in the introduction, she deals with the possibilities of a variety of meanings, or what controls the meaning, right? She looks to the historical context. She looks as well to the canonical context of Scripture, which are going to help shape our understanding of the Beatitudes. And she also, and this is, I think, a helpful aspect of it, she evaluates interpretations based on if they are what she calls generative, or which interpretation generates more fruit. And her control for this is the love of God and the love of neighbor. So that frames the fruitfulness of an interpretation. Does this lead to greater love of the Lord and of others? And that becomes a helpful way of how she navigates the complexity, the variety of the different views in the Beatitudes throughout history. Now, in the first chapter, she orients the reader to the Beatitudes as a whole. And before we even start interpreting the meaning of the individual Beatitudes, there are some general approaches and questions that need to be dealt with. And I've found this to be true myself in my own study of the Beatitudes. And Eklund uses this chapter to address and orient to some of these issues. Some of these include, which lists do we even use when we're thinking about the Beatitudes? Matthew's or Luke's in their Gospels? And should we use them separately, or do they work together? Do they talk with one another? And should we have them talk to one another? Or another one is, are these descriptions or are these demands that need to be followed? In other words, do the Beatitudes speak about something that's going to happen anyways, or are they commands that we should obey? So for instance, one of the Beatitudes is, blessed are those who mourn and they will be comforted. Is this any and all who mourn will be blessed? Going to happen? They're going to get that comforting? Or are we commanded to mourn? And in doing so, we will be comforted. And when does that comfort even happen? So those are some of the questions that she addresses in this first chapter. In the second chapter, she seeks to orient the reader to various approaches and questions that have animated interpreters throughout the centuries. For instance, she describes how many interpreters thought of the Beatitudes as a staircase that is arranged to move upward through the list. So there's a particular arrangement and they move in increasing specificity and importance. Or how Augustine linked each Beatitude to a fruit of the Spirit. She also talks about how the interpretive trajectory lies on a spectrum from, on one end, personal spirituality, that these Beatitudes are lived out personally, and on the other end, social justice, where it's lived out in relationship with others. And this helps frame the various interpretations that show up throughout the book. Some skew more to that one side, some skew to the other, or some kind of in the middle. The remaining chapters that she has in the book deals with each Beatitude specifically from both Matthew and Luke's Gospels where appropriate. And she kind of organizes it based on Matthew's Gospel and then brings in Luke's Gospel with each one that goes with it. I also really like how when she's describing each Beatitude, she tells a story about how this particular passage was lived out in some previous believer's life. And Eklund, with this, is rightly putting the application of these texts front and center. And that this is not just an academic exercise. Now, don't get me wrong, this is an academic book, but it has an eye towards real life and how this is going to be lived out. So Just as Jesus, in giving the Beatitudes, has an eye of this is going to affect our lives, Eklund seeks to bring this out in the history of interpretation and for us as readers. How is this going to speak and affect us in our own readings and our own communities? Who is this book for? Anyone could benefit from this book. Anyone that wants to engage more deeply with the Beatitudes and they want to understand how these texts have been interpreted throughout church history, you're going to get a lot out of this book. This is amazing. Now, a lot about your feelings about a book can be shaped by your expectations. So if you're looking for a specific book about having the Beatitudes minister to you, or how do I apply them in my life right now, that's not this book. There are helpful sections in this book about application, as I've already noted. Eklund has this eye towards application, but this is not a devotional book. This is not a sermon, right? This is an academic book, but this is a really well done and useful book, not just for academics. So additionally, it's also really helpful for pastors, for teachers, for preachers, anyone who's working through the Beatitudes, and it can really help you understand how others may approach these passages. I've found that when I preach or when I teach, a lot of what I have to do is think about how is someone in the audience going to be thinking about this passage. And I want to understand them as I understand this text. So this is really helpful of how others may approach beyond what I may think about this passage or what a specific preacher might think about a passage. Now, if you're also an academic person, this is a can't miss. Like if you're doing actual research on the Beatitudes, you probably want to start with this book. Let's talk about some observations/pros about this book. And I just want to give you some of my feelings, things that I've noticed as I've been reading this book. One thing I want to note is it's academic and it's super well researched. Now, notice this. I don't know if you can see that. Let's see if I look away. The camera might focus. Maybe you can see all the dog ears. This is a well-researched book. This is a go-to research. This is a go-to book to understand the research that has been done about the Beatitudes. Now, this is not totally slanted towards the modern research. You'll get some representative witnesses in this academic listing, but you'll get a wide, broad swath of history with this book. So very academic. But in addition to it being an academic book, it is also highly engaging. That's the thing I really appreciated about this book, is that this book was far more interesting than I initially thought. I thought of it as this is going to be a good research tool, and that's what's going to help me. But I found that I wanted to read more and more. It's very readable. It's not just an academic book. You don't have to be an academic person, and it's not a difficult read at all. And so Eklund has this really wonderful writing style that's really easy to follow. So this is not some dry academic book. It is very engaging. Additionally, the organization that she has in each chapter really lends itself to be easily worked through. And even if you needed to, you can jump around from within the chapter as you're reviewing or as you're reading as needed. So if you're just like, I only got so much time, I'm going to look at this section, you can do that and find a lot of help in the way that she organizes the material. Now, another observation that I've noticed is that this book is very comprehensive. This kind of goes along with the academic note, I guess. But while you can never list or explain everything, Eklund gives a lot of history, great historical and great historical and exegetical depth with various voices and key interpreters. So you're getting lots of witnesses here. She also describes who are the major players in shifting views over time. So there are particular individuals whose interpretations have a long reach in affecting others, and she'll concentrate on those. Another observation is that this book is very thematic. This is a great and helpful organization and explanation method about the Beatitudes. She shows how the development of interpretations and ideas come about rather than a simple chronology as you may see in a lot of other works. For instance, I have this other book, which is the Sermon on the Mount Through the Centuries. Yeah, the Sermon on the Mount Through the Centuries, kind of a different book than what this one is. This one's on the Sermon on the Mount. This one's on the Beatitudes. But this one is organized a bit differently with specific chapters on various interpreters, such as Calvin. What did Calvin think about the Sermon on the Mount, or Spurgeon? This is not worse or better. It's just different, right? And so I particularly like Eklund's approach here for this book. And I really appreciated that because it allowed me to have a more holistic understanding and overview of the Beatitudes themselves. And I personally wasn't particularly interested in one interpreter's understanding. If that's what you're going for, this book might be a little bit better, although this is not just on the Beatitudes. So anyways, I like the way that she organized it because it wasn't just this guy had this view at this date. Like it's very thematic, and you can see the progression and the differences in the various views, no matter where they are in time, in their place in the history of interpretation. The final observation that I have and real pro about this book is the superpower that I mentioned earlier. This book is very sympathetic, and Eklund has this as a superpower in her writing, and especially in this book, is that she takes each view with great respect, even when being critical. So she's very sympathetic to a variety of voices that are being presented. Sometimes she'll call it like, this is a nonsense view, or this has very little support, but she doesn't act dismissively. I think if it was me personally in giving a history of interpretation, I go like, and then this guy said this, and that's bonkers because of X, Y, Z. And she does not do that. She'll be critical where she sees need, but she is very sympathetic in highlighting what other people have to say and let their voices speak for themselves, and allows the reader to evaluate and to judge, is this a viable or is this a fruitful reading of the Beatitudes? So I find that this is a much better approach that Eklund takes than my approach, my default. And I'm learning from her approach. And I think this allows all types of readers to glean much from this book. It can be both encouraging, and here's evidence for supporting my view, but it can also push and challenge us in our interpretations like, ooh, I haven't considered that. So I found that to be especially helpful and a real superpower of this book. Now, there are some questions that I have, or some cons. These are small though, right? The first one is her discussion about multiple meanings, of this idea of generative, of new interpretations and applications. And maybe this just has more to do with me and my understanding of hermeneutics. I just have some questions, right? This is not necessarily a con, but I'm just wondering about how the text can control the meaning of the text itself. That's what I'm interested in. And so I really appreciate her emphasis on the effect of the text on the readers, and that this is going to be applied differently in different contexts. And that is true. But maybe I'm just allergic to the term multiple meaning. That may be. So maybe that's a fault of my own. But that's a question that I have. Maybe not so much of a con, but a question that I have. And this is not something that hinders anything in the book at all. Like, I didn't feel like that kept cropping up all the way through the book. Just a question that I have. Another question that I have, and I'm hesitant to say cons because these are not really cons, but another question I have is, besides the first few introductory chapters, I would have liked to have seen Eklund state her own interpretation a bit more. She does this at several points. She does speak into the conversation, but I would have liked to have seen that a little bit more. And maybe this is just more of me, just like, tell me what it means. Tell me what you think. I want to know what's the answer. And maybe that's more of just a struggle with the Beatitudes themselves than Eklund's book itself. So what this does is it opens the window to various views that have been suggested, and we might not typically think of those. And so this then becomes a way to advance or even check one's interpretations and assumptions, which is a huge pro, not a con. And so none of these cons hinder the helpfulness of the book. It's a fabulous book. So if you've made it this far, then you're probably pretty interested in taking a deeper dive into the Beatitudes. And so what I would say is this book is probably for you. I really can't recommend this book enough. It's excellent, and it is definitely an essential resource for studying the Beatitudes. So that's all I've really got. If you're interested in more videos like this one, I have several other book reviews and videos even on the Beatitudes, which you can see on the end screen in front of you. That's all I've got. Thanks so much. As always, thanks so much for watching, and may the Lord richly bless you.